And you might think, and is the reverse true? Is the Republic the most free state then? And I would argue, and maybe I'm wrong, but in my interpretation, no, the Republic is not the most free. You might think that the ideal Republic, if tyranny is the most enslaved, then the one at the top, the ideal Republic, must be the most free. But I would argue against that. I don't think there's freedom, really, in Plato's ideal Republic. There's far more freedom in democracy in this description that Plato gives us, it seems to me. Because remember that in the top, you're not even allowed to have property or wealth, yeah, if you are one of the guardians. And you're certainly not allowed to sleep with who you want to, because the guardians decide who you sleep with and who you have children with. And so it's not a case of freedom in the ideal Republic. And so again, I want you to be aware that these are very different ideas to perhaps what we have become used to nowadays. And while we may put freedom up on a pedestal, Plato certainly didn't. And I don't think that we're supposed to, well, I don't think you're supposed to read the Republic and believe that Plato has written a book about how great freedom is. If we actually look at the ideal Republic, it's not free, it's a strict hierarchy. There's a strict system of having babies, yeah, there's a strict system of who you can have children with and who you can't have children with. Quite a strange system. And so it's not freedom that's right at the top, and it's not freedom that that Plato has Plato thinks of as one of the highest virtues. Certainly not. Freedom is associated with democracy. That's the interpretation that that's the way I understand it, having read the text. And so the man in the tyrannical state is the most enslaved man. It's the most enslaved mind and soul. He's a slave to his appetites, incapable of acting voluntarily, and also the poorest. Now, how can we understand this? Well, it seems to me that we keep getting told that he's got so many desires, and these desires are never satisfied, that he keeps needing more and more and more money. He spends his wealth, his parents' wealth, and in this sense, he's the poorest. You know, I can't remember, I think it's one of the Stoics who explained that the richest man is the man who has very few wants. I think it was Epictetus. And of course, here he's saying you are a rich man if you don't need to buy anything. You know, you're a rich man with £0 if you don't need to buy anything. It's the person who needs more and more and more who is the poorest. So in that sense, we might think of the tyrant as the poorest, and also the most fearful. Yeah, the most fearful. And of course, if you think about it, with the state, I think tyrannical states, it's quite easy to see how they might be the poorest. Yeah, I mean, even with our modern understanding, you might think that tyrannical states around the world are usually the poorest states, and perhaps this is because the people there, as in the mass, the population, are so poor that they're unable to create some kind of resistance or join together, band together to create some kind of resistance. I'm not sure, really, I'm not sure. But certainly this is an idea in Plato that the tyrannies are the poorest states, okay? And of course the richest would be the one at the top, the ideal republic. But be careful of just associating rich and poor in terms of how much gold you have. I would be careful of that, because you know that in the ideal state, gold doesn't really function. You know, it's not gold that the guardians work for. And so even though it will be there, he did say that currency would be important and would be needed. I get the impression that that's only for the lower orders. The people at the top mustn't work for money. Yeah, and it's also the most fearful state. And again, we can see this, that a tyranny is, of course, a scary place to live in, you know, and people are scared of their neighbours and what maybe their neighbour will grasp them up to the authorities, stuff like that. You're always fearful about the people around you, the people next to you, the people at work. And of course, this is certainly the case. I think this is how we understand a tyranny, as a very fearful place. And a tyrant is also the poorest and the most fearful, because the man is like the state and the state like the man. Yeah, so the tyrant is the most fearful individual out of all of the democrat, timocrat, oligarch. It's the tyrant that's the most fearful. And he again gives us a little story here, tells us to compare a rich individual who owns many slaves, yeah, And then he says, well, a tyrant is basically like a rich individual who owns many slaves, except he owns even more slaves. He has loads of slaves. Everybody in the state is his slave. And so it's just a question of degree. A tyrant is like a rich individual who owns many slaves. He just has even more. Now, he tells us, well, he tells a little story about a rich man who owns many slaves. He's carried off into the wilderness by a god. Yeah, strange story, but he's carried off into the wilderness by a god with his family, his slaves, and his property. And Socrates asks us, well, won't this man be really fearful if this happens? If he's taken out of the state to the wilderness, won't he be really fearful of his slaves? Won't he be worried that the slaves will rob and kill him? Surely he will. Yeah, because it was only the state that was protecting this rich man. In other words, the other rich men in the state, the other free men in the state, would come together to help him if the slaves did something to him. And so he had some protection when he lived under the state. But in the wilderness, he would have no protection. Well, the tyrant is just like this man. And in a sense, he's already in the wilderness because we've already reached this state of tyranny.